Hello, and welcome to another video for elementary educators. In this video, we'll discuss plant anatomy and diversity. Now, I have to warn you, I am a plant person, so this might be a little extensive, but hopefully you'll find it interesting. In this picture, you'll see a mangrove. That's a plant species that I study down in the Bahamas. It's pretty amazing because it survives while living in salt water. Now, most people find plants boring because they don't move, and that's a problem. But plants are plastic. In other words, they can bend their bodies and shapes in order to get more resources. You may have noticed this if you ever put a plant by a window, and over time, the leaves and stems tend to lean towards the source of light. So even though they can't move, they're able to contort and shape their bodies in order to capture more resources. Plants go through two types of growth. Some parts go through determinate growth, which means that part grows to a certain size and stops. Think of a leaf, for example. Leaves don't just keep growing and growing and growing. If that were the case, trees would only need one giant leaf. But instead, the leaves go to a certain size and stop. But other parts of the tree have indeterminate growth, which means they keep growing and growing and growing and growing. Think of a tree trunk. It just gets wider and wider. Think about the roots. They keep growing on and on and on. Now, when you think of plants, the first thing you think of are probably leaves. These are important structures because they are where photosynthesis happens. This is essentially how the plant feeds itself. Photosynthesis is the process where plants trap light energy and use it to create sugar, which is a molecule that contains energy. Leaves are also important because they are where water leaves the plant. This is a process called transpiration. On the surface of the leaves are little holes called stomata, and when a plant does photosynthesis, it opens up that stomata to take in carbon dioxide, which it uses to make sugar. However, when those openings are open, water leaks out. Now let's discuss the structure of a leaf. First, on the top of the leaf is a layer called the epidermis. This is a single layer of cells that protects the upper surface of the leaf. There are no chloroplasts in this layer, so no photosynthesis happens in the very top layer. Those cells are covered with cuticle or cutin, which is a waxy substance that keeps the leaves from desiccating or falling apart. On the leaf surface, in the epidermis, you have those tiny openings I mentioned before, called stomata. Stomata are comprised of two cells called guard cells, which open and close or swell and deswell to create an opening where water can go out and carbon dioxide can come in. Below the epidermis of leaves, you have layers referred to as the mesophyll. This is the most important part of the leaf because this is where you have cells that contain chloroplasts, which have chlorophyll, which are the pigments that absorb light. Here in the picture, you can see the two different layers of mesophyll. You have the palisade layer, which are really dense stacks of cells where most of the photosynthesis happens and most light capture happens. And just below that, you have the spongy mesophyll. It's called spongy because there are a lot of air spaces between the cells. Here is a picture of a leaf cross-section seen under a microscope. You can see the mesophyll layers. Also, what you can see in this cross-section of the leaf is the leaf vein. Now, the leaf vein is important because those are the pipes that transport sugar to the rest of the plant and water to the leaf. The veins are comprised of two types of pipes, xylem pipes and phloem pipes. Xylem are the tubes that transport water, and phloem are the tubes that transport sugar. Now, leaves are attached to stems, and stems are basically connective structures that connect leaves to the roots. They can be involved in storage, but their main job is transport. On a stem, you have two regions. You have the node, which is where new leaves and flowers emerge, and the internode, which is the space between the nodes. The leaf blade attaches to the node by a little twig structure called the petiole. Here is an example of a plant stem with leaves attached to it. You can see where the leaves emerged. Those are the nodes. Just above the leaves, you may see a little brown structure called a bud. That is a region of new growth where new stems can emerge. The spaces between the nodes is the internode. Those spaces just elongate and get longer and wider. The bud at the very end of the stem is called the terminal bud, and its primary responsibility is lengthening the plant or leading the way in terms of growing towards light. Plants that grow for more than 1 year have growth in their stems, and the stems expand and get wider and wider. If you were to cut a tree down, for example, you'll see that growth in rings. Each ring represents a year. The reason why plants form rings is because in the winter the plants go dormant and growth stops. But in the spring, when it warms up again and they start to produce leaves and photosynthesize, they grow. And so new rings form every year. These are referred to as annual rings. You can see the annual rings in this picture. Below ground, plants have roots, and roots have lots of different functions. One of their main functions is to anchor the plant, to prevent it from falling over. The other, most important, is absorption. This is how the plant absorbs water and minerals such as nutrients like nitrogen and phosphorus. Also, in some plants, roots can be used for storage, to store sugar that was made during the growing season. Here we see this in this radish, where the red part is actually part of the root structure and is used to hold sugar. Now there are two main types of roots, taproots and fibrous roots. With taproots, you have a primary single root that goes very deep into the ground. It is called a taproot because it is trying to tap water. Tap means to access. So when you tap a keg, you are trying to get access to beer. A taproot is trying to get access to water. Fibrous roots are roots that you might see on grasses and things. They're a little bit different. Notice there isn't one main central root, instead of a lot of little roots. Fibrous roots are very good at absorbing nutrients, but they don't go very deep into the soil. If you were to zoom in to a side of a root, you will see how the cells are laid out. And along the surface, you might see a root hair, which is an extension of a root cell. Root hairs are important because they increase surface area for the plant. Now, when it comes to absorbing nutrients and water, roots want to have as much surface area as possible because surface area means more contact. So let's talk a little bit about plant diversity. If we were to focus on the plants we cultivate, in other words, grow for human use, we would find that most of our plants that we pick to cultivate come from these regions in color. Notice how most of them come from regions near water or near the equator. But what plants do we cultivate the most? Now, if you were to look more closely at what plants we cultivate and where they come from, you'll see some interesting trends. In the Mediterranean regions, you'll notice that we've got some of our cereal grains and things like olives. In the Chinese region, you see we have some of our stone fruits like peaches and bamboo. In Africa, you have some of our more drought-tolerant species and things that grow below ground. In South Asia, you'll see things such as sugarcane and some tropical fruits like mangoes and citrus. In South and Central America, you'll see things like corn, potato, tomatoes, and cotton. Our contribution from North America is not very much. It's kind of sad. But what we contribute to the global agricultural industry are sunflowers, tobacco, blueberries, and cranberries. Now, I always joke that our contribution will either give you cancer or cure a UTI. So let's examine the diversity of plants, starting with the most simple plants. Now, the simplest of all plants are referred to as bryophytes. This includes things like mosses, the tiny, tiny little plants that grow on rock surfaces and underground in wet places. There's 23,000 different species of bryophytes, and in addition to mosses, there are things called liverworts and hornworts. So bryophytes are interesting because they don't have xylem or phloem, those pipes I told you about that transport water and sugar. Because they don't have a way to transport things, they have to be very, very small, very, very short so that they can move things. They reproduce sexually and use water to transport sperm to the egg. There are 3 phylum of bryophytes. There are liverworts, hornworts, and mosses. Liverworts are called that because they have leaves that are shaped like livers, triangular shape. Here is a picture cartoon kind of showing you what a cross-section of a liverwort looks like. You'll notice how simple it is. There's a few layers of cells, a surface layer of cells that have chloranthema, which are cells that do photosynthesis. Below that, you have parenchyma cells, which are filler, and then very small root structures called rhizoids. The most common type of liverwort is Marchantia. The next phylum are the hornworts, the Anthocerophyta, and they're called that because they look like little horns. They have asexual reproduction due to fragmentation. In other words, little pieces of the plant can fragment off and develop into a new plant. Now, mosses are the most common bryophyte, and there's 15,000 different species of moss. Here you see the moss. Notice how you have the greenish structures down below, and they have these long, skinny stalks that grow from them. Those stalks are where spores emerge from. If you're to look at mosses up close, you'll notice that there's a lot of air spaces or places to store water. This is why we use mosses in flower arrangements, because they can store water and keep the plants moist. Mosses are important because they are pioneer species. A pioneer species is the first species that arrives in an ecosystem after a major disturbance. They initiate the process called succession, which is basically the process of ecosystem change over time. They're an indicator of surface water, so you will not have mosses where the ground is dry. We use them for packing material. There was a time we used mosses to stuff seats of cars like Volkswagen Bugs. And bryophytes such as peat mosses are very important because of their ability to absorb. So again, remember, all the bryophytes lack vasculature. They lack the pipes to move sugar and water. So over the course of evolution, plants did develop this vasculature and were able to move water, which allowed the plants to get a little bit taller. Thus, you had the formation of your vascular plants, plants that were slightly bigger than mosses. There are basically 4 phylum. There's the Xylophyta, as pictured here on the top right, which have stems that fork evenly. You have the Lycophyta. This is referred to as a ground pine in this picture, but it is not a pine tree. But they just look like little Christmas trees, don't they? You have the Equistophyta, which are horsetails, and they have long whorled leaves called microphylls. And you have your Polypodiophyta, which is a fancy way of saying ferns. Poly meaning many, podia meaning feet, and so that's where we get the term for ferns. They have large leaves called megaphylls, which are comprised of lots of little leaflets. So over the course of evolution, you had your non-vascular plants, mosses and things, and then they evolved to have some vasculature. However, at this point, they still did not have seeds. Their reproduction was a little bit different. Over time, seeds developed, and then you had more complicated plants called Gymnosperms and Angiosperms. Seeds were an important evolutionary adaptation. Why? Well, in a seed, you have the developing baby, or a zygote, entrapped inside an integument, or a thick skin layer. This allowed the baby to be protected, and it also allowed to survive periods of dormancy, like the colds of winter. The first plants to evolve the use of seeds were Gymnosperms. Gymnosperm meaning naked seed. And this is because Gymnosperms do not have seeds in fruit, like the apple pictured here. The seeds were naked and often emerged from structures like cones. To have the formation of seeds, you have to have a fertilization event. You have to have a contribution from male and female. Male comes in the form of sperm, which are inside pollen grains. Females produce eggs or ovules, which can be fertilized by those sperm. Once those eggs are fertilized, an integument or skin layer forms around the seed for protection. There are 4 different phyla of Gymnosperms. The Pinophyta, which are mostly our conifers, the Ginkgophyta, the Hepaticophyta, and the Cnidophyta. The G is silent. Now the main family in the Pinophyta are the pines. Pines are recognizable by their long green needles. Needles function like leaves, but they're needles because they don't have blades like leaf blades do. A cluster of needles is called a fascicle. Here we see a cluster in the picture, the cross-section, where you can see the structures inside each needle. They function just like a leaf, and they have a lot of the same structures that leaves do. In regards to pine reproduction, pines produce 2 kinds of cones. They produce male pollen cones and female ovule cones. Pictured here are the male pollen cones. Pine reproduction takes 2 years, as it takes a long time for the pollen to get to the eggs, for the eggs to be fertilized, and for the fertilized eggs to develop into seeds. In the first year, pollen is released from the pollen cones and it gets caught on the stickiness of the female cones. The pollen then produces a structure called a pollen tube. This is a long tube that goes from the pollen grain to the egg. Sperm are delivered to the egg through that tube. The megaspore is what results in the production of the egg. In the second year, the female parts mature and eventually that sperm unites with the egg. So it takes a long time for this whole process to happen. When the sperm fertilizes the egg, it forms something called a zygote. The other sperm degenerates. And the zygote then gets a skin layer around it called the integument, which becomes the seed coat. Here you see a picture of a pine cone. On each scale of the pine cone, there will be 2 seeds. Pines are conifers, and there's other conifers in the Pinophyta, such as spruces and firs. There's a lot of things we do with these, where there's a lot of human importance to them. We use the wood to build things like furniture, but things like pine trees, they grow very, very tall and very, very straight. And so often we use them for things like telephone poles, road ties, masts of boats, and things like that. Pines have very soft wood, which we use to make pulp, which eventually leads to things like paper and toilet paper. A lot of the Pinophyta are also used as ornamentals. The next phylum are the Ginkgophyta, which comprise of the ginkgo. There's only 1 species living in this phyla. This species is deciduous, which means it loses its leaves in the fall. Now there are male trees and female trees. This is because this species is dioecious. So the male trees produce the pollen and the female trees produce the egg. Here we can see in the picture where pollen is produced in the male strobili of the male trees, and here we see the seeds on the female tree. Now the seeds look like fruit, but they're not. They're not surrounded by a fleshy fruit layer. And so what you're looking at is the seed. Notice the fan shape of the leaves, and that's a classic ginkgo leaf shape. Ginkgos are very popular for urban landscaping because they are very tolerant of pollution. However, when you're planting ginkgos, it's important to use male trees and not female trees. This is because when female seeds drop on the ground, they rot, and the rotting seeds smell like vomit. The next phylum are the Cycadophytas. These cycads have these complex leaves that look like palm leaves. In the US, there's only 1 species of cycad. This species is also dioecious, meaning that there are male and female plants that are separate. Monoecious species are species that have male and female structures on the same plant. The last phyla are the Cnidophyta, or Cnidophytes. This is a weird phyla because they basically had a few species that they couldn't group into the other phyla, so they grouped them together. Included in this are the joint furs, which are pictured here. So let's talk about what happens to the seeds after they're dropped. They essentially do something called germinate. Sometimes before they germinate, they go through a period of dormancy. Sometimes they need physical factors to break that dormancy. For example, some seeds might have a skin layer that is so thick that the baby can't emerge out of it. And so it needs something to break that skin layer. That something could be something like a bird, which ingests it, and whose gizzard, which contains rocks and sand, can break that skin layer. When the bird poops, the seed comes out and is then able to germinate. To germinate is basically to grow and develop into a plant. You need a lot of favorable conditions for a seed to germinate. You need the presence of water and oxygen, and often you need light. Sometimes temperature is important too, as a lot of things will not germinate in the cold. Now, the other group of plants that have seeds are called Angiosperms, and these are flowering plants. Angiosperm meaning vessel for the plant, and by vessel we mean fruit. So all the plants in this phylum produce fruits that contain the seeds inside. The seeds develop at the base of a pistil, which is a portion of the flower that we'll talk about in a second. What the fruit is the ovary, because it contains a lot of seeds inside. Let's look at the structure of a flower. Flower has several different parts, the first part being the sepals. The sepals are the green leaf-like structures at the base of the flower. They are often there to protect the emerging bud before the flower blooms. Because they're green, you can assume that they are also photosynthetic. The next structure are the petals. Now, petals are what make the flowers look nice, but they actually perform a function. They're brightly colored because they are used to attract pollinators, like bees, to bring them to them. Those attractants bring the bees there so that they can grab pollen and take it to another flower. The reproductive parts of the flower are the stamens and the pistils. The stamens are where the pollen is formed, the male structures of the plant. The pistil are the female structures of the plant. The pistil is composed of three parts, the stigma, the style, and the ovary. The stigma is the top part, which often is very sticky so that pollen will stick to it. At the base of the style is the ovary, which develops into the fruit. Now, not all plants in the Angiosperm phylum have fancy flowers. Sometimes those flowers are greatly reduced, such as the flowers in the grass family, which contains a lot of cereal grains like barley. We can see pictured here the very reduced flower. It doesn't really look like a flower at all. It doesn't have the showy petals, but it does have the reproductive parts, in that it has a stigma and an ovary. So when we think of flowers, often we think of things like roses. Roses are a simple flower, but in nature, sometimes flowers can be a little bit more complicated. In fact, when you look at a flower, are you really looking at one? No, you might actually be looking at a lot of different flowers all at once. For example, when you look at a sunflower, you think you're looking at one flower, but in fact, you're actually looking at a group of lots of little flowers called florets. So some flowers are compound, meaning that they're composed of lots of little flowers. When we look at a compound flower, we describe it by its inflorescence, or the shape of that group of flowers. You can see in this picture all the different shapes compound flowers can make. A lot of the flowers in the aster family, such as mums, dandelions, and sunflowers, are compound flowers. So you could always trick somebody and give them a sunflower and say you got them a bunch of flowers. They might be confused, but you'll know the truth. So the main purpose of flowers is to attract pollinators, attract insects or birds or other animals to it so that they can take pollen from one flower to another flower where it can eventually fertilize an egg. Flowers often have smells or brightly colors in order to attract those pollinators. So let's discuss pollination. Now, in order for a flower to attract a pollinator, it might have to have certain colors or certain smells to attract that pollinator. Not every bee is attracted to every flower, for example. So they have been co-evolved. In other words, the plants have evolved with the pollinators to have means to attract them in a successful way. For example, flowers that rely on bees will have very brightly colored petals, mostly blue or yellow. This is because bees see in UV, and so the flowers appear a little different to them. You can see in the picture a yellow aster. Notice how bright the leaves are, but in UV, they look a little bit different. This is what the flower looks like to a bee. So again, bees like brightly colored flowers. Beetles are pollinators that are attracted to strong, spicy, or yeasty smelling flowers, such as roses. Flies can be used as pollinators for flowers that smell like rotten meat. Flies are attracted to meat because they're always looking for places to feed or places to lay their eggs. Their maggots that develop from those eggs want to feed on flesh, and so sometimes plants can use trickery to attract flies. Butterflies and moths are attracted to very sweet smelling flowers. So if you decide to build a butterfly garden, you want to have very sweet smelling flowers, like salvias. Bird flowers are often very brightly colored and don't often have a smell. This is because birds do not have a real good sense of smell, and so they have to be very showy to attract the bird. Some flowers use bats as pollinators. And in order to do this, they must bloom at night because that's when bats are most often flying around. Often they're dull in color, but they offer a reward to the bat, such as nectar, so the bat will fly around. Orchid flowers are examples of our most evolved fancy flowers. They have petals that have different shapes that have different functions. Once in a while, you'll see a very adapted, very evolved orchid that has a special petal that looks like a bug. And so the flower uses trickery to convince the bug that there is a potential mate waiting for it. When the bug lands on it to mate, it gets tricked into actually grabbing pollen, which comes in the form of a sac called pollinia, and then the bug will then fly away. So let's talk about fruits. Fruits are the mature ovary of the plant because they contain all the seeds. You may have heard about people debating about what is a fruit versus what is a vegetable. And the way to tell them apart is very simple. If there are seeds inside, it is a fruit. If it is another part of the plant, it is a vegetable. So yes, tomatoes are fruit. So are cucumbers and zucchini and eggplant. We call them vegetables at the dinner table, but they're actually fruits. If you were to look at the fruit up close, it's comprised of different parts or different layers. Often they have different tissue layers. They might have a skin on the outside called an exocarp, and then they have a fleshy inside. The endocarp is the innermost boundary around the seed, and the mesocarp is the stuff in between those two layers. There are many kinds of fruit. Different kinds of fruit develop from different kinds of plants and may depend on factors like how many eggs there are in the flower, which results in how many seeds there are. And there may be differences in the fruit in terms of whether it's fleshy or dry, whether it splits open or not. Let's look at some of the different types of fruit. Now, when we think of fruits, we most often think of fleshy fruits or fruits that have like some moisture to them, like a peach. The simplest fruits are called drupes. A drupe is a fruit that has a single seed or pit inside. So this includes olives, avocados, peaches, and cherries. Now, if a fleshy fruit has more than one seed, it's likely that it's something called a berry. Now, this is a term that gets thrown around and it's often used inaccurately. So a berry is anything that's fleshy with thin skin on the outside and lots of seeds on the inside. A cherry is not a berry, nor is a strawberry because the seeds are not on the inside. A true berry has very thin skin. So believe it or not, tomatoes, grapes, peppers, bananas are all types of berry. One berry that's a berry is a blueberry. Now another type of berry has a thicker skin to it and is referred to as a pepo. And this includes a lot of our gourd vegetables like pumpkins and cucumbers. But again, they're not vegetables, they're fruits. If the berry has a fleshy skin to it, like our citrus, then it is called a Hesperidium. This includes our oranges, our limes, lemons, grapefruits, tangelos, and our little clementines. Pome is another type of fruit that comes from mostly the rose family. This includes apples and pears. It is formed from something called an inferior ovary. An inferior ovary is an ovary that forms below the surface of the petals. When you eat an apple, the part where you put your finger on, you might notice that there's almost like these little petally like things on one end, opposite of where the stem is. That is the product of the flower and the fruit forming below the flower. Now let's get into some of our dry fruits. They're dry because they're not really fleshy. Dry fruits can be broken down into two groups, dehiscent fruits or indehiscent fruits. Dehiscent means they split when the fruit is mature. For example, this milkweed follicle in the middle splits open to release the seeds. Legumes, such as beans, peas, and peanuts, are another type of dehiscent fruit because when they fully mature, they split open to drop the seeds. Another type of dehiscent fruit are capsules. These are fruits that basically open to kind of explode the seeds out. This includes things like poppies. Indehiscent fruits do not split at maturity, and so they're a little bit modified. And again, remember, they're dry. One example of this is a fruit called an achene, and that's something like a sunflower. An achene is a fruit where the outside skin is merged or fused to the inside stuff. Also, nuts are a type of indehiscent fruit. They are dry and the outside is fused to the stuff on the inside. This includes acorns, hazelnuts, and hickory nuts. Remember, a peanut is not a nut, it is a legume. Another type of indehiscent fruit are samaras. These are winged fruits. You may have seen those little things that fly out of maple trees that kind of helicopter down to the ground. Those winged fruits are samaras. Also, fruits that occur in the grain family, such as corn, wheat, rice, and barley, are caryopses, which is another type of fruit where the outside skin is fused to the stuff on the inside. This concludes our discussion on plant diversity and anatomy. Thanks for watching.